At my grandson's birthday, my daughter-in-law called security and said, "Get this tacky old woman out of here." She had no idea that I owned the penthouse where they lived and the properties that funded their entire lifestyle. The next day, I raised their rent to market rates and withdrew my financial support. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought my own family would treat me like a stranger at my grandson's birthday party. But there I was, standing at the entrance of that elegant restaurant in downtown Chicago, clutching a carefully wrapped gift for Kenta's 4th birthday, watching my daughter-in-law, Sarah, whisper something to a security guard while pointing directly at me. The look in her eyes wasn't just dismissive. It was pure disgust, the same look she'd given me when I'd questioned the medical report about Kenta's recent checkup. The same cold stare she'd used when I dared to suggest that something might be wrong with my great-nephew's health. "Mum, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the security guard said, his voice apologetic but firm. He was young, probably around my nephew Tomoya's age, and I could see he didn't want to be doing this. His eyes darted nervously between Sarah's expectant face and my shocked expression. "I'm sorry." "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were shaking as I held Kenta's gift tighter. "I'm Kenta's great-aunt. This is my great-nephew's party. I helped plan his first 3 birthdays." That's when Sarah's voice cut through the chatter of the other guests like a knife through silk. "No mistake here. Remove this tacky old woman from here." She said it loud enough for everyone to hear, her voice dripping with the same condescension she'd used when dismissing my concerns about Kenta's health just weeks ago. The same tone she used whenever she wanted to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. I felt my face burn with humiliation. This woman, this person who had married into our family, was having me escorted out like I was some kind of threat to their precious celebration. The conversations around us stopped like someone had pressed a pause button on the entire party. Some guests turned to stare at the spectacle unfolding at the entrance, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. Parents with their children, neighbors from their exclusive building, Tomoya's colleagues from the hospital, all of them watching as my own family had me escorted out like some kind of criminal. I could see the shock on some faces, the curiosity on others. And worst of all, the knowing looks from those who had probably heard Sarah's complaints about the difficult old woman who didn't know her place. The woman who asked too many questions about her great-nephew's health. The woman who didn't understand that modern families had boundaries. My hands trembled as I held Kenta's gift tighter. A beautiful wooden train said I'd spent weeks crafting in my small workshop. Through the crowd, I could see him in his little superhero costume, completely oblivious to what was happening to his great-aunt. He was laughing, running around with the other children, beautiful and innocent. His dark hair tousled from play, and completely unaware that his mother was making sure I couldn't even wish him happy birthday. Just like he'd been unaware of the real results of his medical checkup that his parents had hidden from me. Just like he was unaware that his parents had been lying to both of us about his health. "Sarah, please," I managed to say, stepping closer to her despite the security guard's gentle but firm hand on my arm. She was wearing one of those designer dresses that cost more than most people make in a month, a sleek black number that hugged her figure perfectly. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, her makeup flawless despite the Chicago humidity. Everything about her screamed money and status money that came from the properties I owned, though she had no idea. "It's Kenta's birthday. I just want to give him his present. I just want to tell him I love him." She looked at me like I was something disgusting she'd found on the bottom of her expensive Italian leather shoes. "You're embarrassing yourself, Marie. Look around." She gestured with one manicured hand to the elegant venue, the perfectly decorated tables with their pristine white linens and crystal centerpieces, the expensive floral arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "This isn't your kind of place. These aren't your kind of people." The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. Not my kind of place, not my kind of people. I was wearing my best dress, the navy blue one I'd bought specifically for special occasions like this. I'd spent an hour doing my hair, carefully applying makeup that I rarely wore. Even bought new shoes that pinched my feet but looked appropriate for such an elegant venue. But apparently none of that mattered to Sarah. "Where's Tomoya?" I asked, looking around desperately for my nephew. For someone who might defend me, for anyone who might remember that I was family. "Where is he?" Oh, he's busy with important guests, Sarah said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that made my stomach turn. People who actually belong here. People who understand social boundaries and know when their presence is appropriate. The security guard looked increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. I could see in his young face that he didn't like what he was being asked to do. "Mom, I really need you to come with me," he said gently, his voice kind despite the circumstances. He guided me toward the exit with a touch so gentle it almost made me cry. I caught a glimpse of Tomoya across the room. He was talking animatedly with a group of doctors in expensive suits, all of them laughing at something he'd said. He looked successful, confident, completely at ease in this world of wealth and sophistication. For a moment I felt proud of what he'd become, of the man he'd grown into. Then reality crashed back over me. He was completely unaware of what was happening to his aunt. Or maybe, and this thought made my chest tighten with a pain I hadn't felt since my husband died 20 years ago. Maybe he knew and simply didn't care. "My gift," I said weakly, still holding the wrapped package that had taken me so many hours to create. The train set inside represented weeks of careful work, each car hand-painted with Kenta's favorite colors, each detail crafted with love. "Leave it on the table by the door," Sarah called out dismissively, not even bothering to look at me anymore. She was already turning back to her guests, already putting on her hostess smile. "Someone will make sure Kenta gets it." But I knew she was lying. I could see it in the way she glanced at the gift table, in the slight wrinkle of her nose as she looked at my modest wrapping paper compared to the elaborate packages from the other guests. I knew that gift would end up in the trash just like I was being thrown out, just like all my efforts to be part of this family were being discarded. As the security guard walked me toward the parking lot, his hand still gentle on my elbow, I heard Sarah's voice behind us, already moving on, already forgetting I existed. "Sorry about that, everyone. Some people just don't know their place. Now, where were we? Oh, yes, Kenta was about to blow out his candles." I sat in my modest Toyota Camry for 20 minutes before I could stop shaking enough to drive. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, and I could feel tears threatening to spill over despite my efforts to maintain some dignity. The irony of it all was almost too much to bear. Sarah standing there in her designer dress in that expensive venue, surrounded by luxury and status telling me I didn't belong. If only she knew the truth. If only she knew that every dollar paying for that party, every cent funding their comfortable lifestyle, every penny keeping that family afloat came from my real estate investments. If only she understood that the woman she'd just dismissed as beneath her notice was the very foundation of their financial security. The penthouse where Tomoya and Sarah lived, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and panoramic views of Lake Michigan, I owned that building. The state-of-the-art medical practice where Tomoya worked as a pediatrician. Seeing the children of Chicago's elite, I owned that property too. The parking garage where half the guests at that party had parked their BMWs and Mercedes mine as well. 43 years of careful investment and sacrifice. Built from nothing after my husband died and left me with basic accounting skills, a small life insurance payout, and a determination to never be dependent on anyone again. I'd started with a small duplex in a modest neighborhood and built it into a real estate portfolio worth $8 million. And I'd done it all quietly, keeping my wealth hidden behind modest living and careful financial planning, never wanting Tomoya to feel burdened by the weight of his aunt's success or to wonder if his achievements were truly his own. I'd wanted him to make his own way in the world as a doctor. I'd wanted him to earn his position through merit, through hard work and dedication, not because of who his aunt was or what she owned. So I'd stayed in the shadows, living modestly in my small condo with its second-hand furniture and outdated appliances, driving my reliable but aging car, shopping at regular stores and clipping coupons, all while my properties provided comfortable lives for dozens of tenants, including my own family. The family that had just thrown me out like garbage. I started the car and drove home slowly through the Chicago streets, my mind racing with a mixture of hurt, anger, and something else, something cold and calculating that I hadn't felt in decades. For years I'd endured Sarah's subtle cruelty, her backhanded comments about my appearance, my modest home, my simple lifestyle. I'd bitten my tongue when she made jokes about my quaint ways and my supposed lack of understanding of their sophisticated world. I'd stayed quiet when she questioned my concerns about Kenta's health, dismissing my worries as those of an overprotective old woman who didn't understand modern medicine. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how she'd managed to turn my own nephew against me. How she'd gradually convinced him that I was an embarrassment, a burden, someone to be managed rather than loved. I'd watched over the years as Tomoya changed from the warm, caring young man I'd helped raise into someone who seemed embarrassed by his roots, by his family, by me. But this public humiliation at my great-nephew's birthday party, this was different. This was war. Sarah wanted to see what happened when she pushed too far. She wanted to find out what it felt like to cross the wrong person. Well, tomorrow morning she was going to get her wish. Tomorrow morning, their comfortable lifestyle was going to undergo some very necessary adjustments. The Penthouse building stood 62 stories tall in the heart of Chicago's Gold Coast, its glass and steel facade reflecting the morning sun like a beacon of prosperity. Every month for the past 15 years, I'd driven past it on my way to collect rent from my other properties, looking up at the gleaming structure that I owned, feeling a quiet pride that no one else could understand. My tenants knew me as Marie Yamamoto, the quiet property owner who preferred to work through management companies and valued her privacy above all else. The few who had met me in person knew I was polite but reserved, professional but distant. What they didn't know was that Marie Yamamoto, the modest retiree, and Marie Yamamoto, the real estate investor, were the same person, and that the woman they occasionally saw in the lobby checking on maintenance issues was worth more than most of them could imagine. I'd built this portfolio from nothing, and I'd done it the hard way. After my husband died, I was 45 years old with basic accounting knowledge and no real investment experience. Kenji had been a good man, hardworking and devoted to our family, but traditional in his thinking. He handled the finances, the investments, the business decisions. I took care of the household, supported his career, and focused on helping raise Tomoya after his parents died in that car accident when he was just 12. When that stroke took Kenji suddenly one winter morning, I realized I didn't even know how our investments worked or what we actually owned. The life insurance money lasted 18 months. Then I was truly on my own, a middle-aged widow with a teenage nephew to finish raising and no clear path forward. I started by buying a small duplex in a working-class neighborhood with our meager savings. It was nothing glamorous, a 1960s brick building that needed new plumbing and had outdated electrical work, but it was solid. I lived in one unit and rented out the other. The rental income covered the mortgage, and I used my part-time bookkeeping job to pay for everything else. It was tight, incredibly tight, but it worked. But I was determined to do more than just survive. I was ambitious in a way that surprised even me. I'd watch other investors at the hardware store, see how they operated, listen to their conversations about property values and market trends. I started asking questions, learning how things worked, studying the real estate market with the intensity of a graduate student. Within 3 years, I had purchased a second duplex. Within 7 years, I owned a small apartment building. I reinvested every penny of profit, lived on rice and beans for weeks at a time, wore the same coat for 5 winters in a row. No expensive vacations, no luxury purchases, no fancy restaurants. Every dollar went back into the properties, into improvements, into the next acquisition. I learned about commercial real estate by reading every book I could find. I studied property management by shadowing other landlords. I taught myself about tenant relations by making every mistake possible and learning from each one. I took night courses in real estate investment and property law, sitting in classrooms full of men half my age who assumed I was someone's secretary taking notes. By the time Tomoya finished medical school, I owned 12 residential properties across Chicago's North Side. Each one had been carefully chosen, meticulously maintained, and lovingly improved. By the time he started his practice, I'd expanded into commercial real estate, purchasing small office buildings and retail spaces. By the time he got married, my portfolio was worth $6 million and growing steadily. And through it all, Tomoya never knew. I wanted him to have a normal relationship with his career, to feel proud of his accomplishments without wondering if his success was due to family connections. I didn't want him growing up thinking he was special because his aunt was wealthy, or worse, feeling guilty about my sacrifices on his behalf. So I kept living in my modest condo. I kept driving reliable but unremarkable cars and shopping at reasonable stores. I kept being just Tomoya's aunt, the widow who worked hard and lived simply, who worried about him and loved him unconditionally, but never made demands on his time or attention. When Tomoya graduated from medical school with honors, I made sure there was an affordable office space available in one of my buildings. Not because he was my nephew, but because he was qualified and hardworking and deserved a chance to build something meaningful. I watched from the shadows as he built his practice, earning patients' trust, building his reputation in Chicago's medical community. I was so proud of him, so happy to see him succeeding. And he never knew his success was taking place in his aunt's building. Then he married Sarah. From the beginning, she made it clear that I wasn't sophisticated enough for their vision of family life. Tomoya had done well for himself, earning a substantial income as a pediatrician specializing in childhood developmental disorders. His reputation was growing, and he was often consulted on complex cases by other doctors in the city. Sarah had her own career in pharmaceutical sales, pulling in another generous paycheck while traveling to medical conferences and building relationships with healthcare providers throughout the Midwest. Together, they could afford the lifestyle she wanted: the expensive penthouse, with its designer furniture and stunning views, the designer clothes that filled her walk-in closet, the exclusive restaurants where they were known by name. But I wasn't polished enough for their world. I wasn't educated enough in the right subjects, wasn't wealthy enough in the right way, wasn't connected enough to the right people. At least that's what she thought. I endured her comments about my modest condo with its outdated kitchen and second-hand furniture. I bit my tongue when she made jokes about my discount store clothes and my supposed lack of culture. "Marie always means well," she'd say to Tomoya when she thought I couldn't hear. "But she just doesn't understand our world. She's from a different generation, a different level." I stayed quiet when she questioned whether I was capable of properly understanding Kenta's medical needs, suggesting that my concerns were those of an anxious old woman who didn't grasp the complexities of modern healthcare. When I'd ask about his test results or suggest certain symptoms needed investigation, she'd dismiss me with a patronizing smile and a comment about how medicine had changed since my day. What hurt the most was watching Tomoya change. The young man who used to call me every Sunday just to chat, who brought me flowers from his hospital's garden, who told his colleagues that his aunt was the strongest person he knew, that young man gradually became someone who seemed embarrassed by me. He never defended me when Sarah made her cutting remarks. He never spoke up when she found increasingly creative excuses to exclude me from family gatherings. He just stood by and watched as his wife slowly pushed his aunt out of their lives, his silence serving as tacit approval for her behavior. The breaking point came 3 months ago when Kenta had his annual checkup. As his great-aunt and the person who had been most involved in his healthcare since birth, I'd always been included in discussions about his medical care. I'd been the one to take him to his first pediatrician appointments when Tomoya was working long hours building his practice. I'd been there for his vaccinations, his ear infections, his first broken bone when he fell off his tricycle. But this time, when I asked about Kenta's test results, Sarah brushed me off with an impatience that caught me off guard. "Everything's fine, Marie. Just routine blood work. Nothing for you to worry about." Her tone was dismissive, almost annoyed that I'd asked. But something in her manner made me suspicious. There was a tightness around her eyes, a forced casualness in her voice that didn't ring true. I'd learned to read people during my years as a landlord, and Sarah was definitely hiding something. So I called Tomoya directly, catching him between patients at his office. "The tests were normal, Aunt Marie. Sarah's right, nothing to worry about." But I knew my nephew, and I could hear something in his voice. A hesitation, a carefully controlled tone that suggested he wasn't telling me everything. There was a strain there that hadn't been present in our conversations about Kenta's previous checkups. I'd raised Tomoya from the age of 12. I knew when he was lying, when he was worried, when he was trying to protect me from something. And right now, he was definitely trying to protect me from something. So I did what any concerned great-aunt would do. I called the pediatrician's office directly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Yamamoto," the nurse said after checking Kenta's file. "I can't discuss specific test results due to privacy regulations, but I can tell you that Dr. Nakamura did recommend some follow-up tests and dietary changes. Didn't the parents discuss this with you? Usually family members who've been involved in a child's care are kept informed of significant changes. Follow-up tests, dietary changes, nothing to worry about." The blood in my veins turned to ice. If there was nothing to worry about, why were they hiding it from me? Why the lies, the evasions, the deliberate exclusion from information about my great-nephew's health? When I confronted Tomoya about the discrepancy, he finally admitted the truth, but only after I pressed him repeatedly and made it clear I already knew something was wrong. Kenta's blood sugar levels were elevated, he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. It's not diabetes yet, but it's concerning. We need to monitor his diet carefully, maybe adjust his activity levels, possibly start some preventive medications if the numbers don't improve. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Why didn't you tell me? Sarah thought it would just make you worry unnecessarily. She said you tend to overreact to medical issues, and she didn't want you to panic or start treating Kenta like he was sick when he's probably going to be fine. Overreact? I'm his great-aunt. I have a right to know if he has health concerns. I've been part of his medical care since the day he was born. Aunt Marie, please. The weariness in his voice was palpable. Sarah handles all of Kenta's medical decisions now. She's his mother. She knows what's best for him. And what do you think, Tomoya? Do you think I overreact? Do you think I don't deserve to know when my great-nephew has a serious health concern? The silence that followed was answer enough. That was when I realized they weren't just excluding me from social gatherings and family decisions. They were excluding me from the most important aspects of Kenta's life, his health, his well-being, his future. And they were lying to me about it, treating me like I was some kind of hysterical old woman who couldn't be trusted with the truth. The cruelest part was that they were using money from my properties to finance their comfortable lifestyle, while they systematically erased me from Kenta's life. The penthouse where they lived, the medical building where Tomoya practiced, the very foundation of their financial security, all of it came from my investments, my hard work, my decades of sacrifice, and they were using that security to cut me out of the family I'd helped build. But at yesterday's party, Sarah had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, having me physically removed from my own great-nephew's birthday party, calling me tacky and embarrassing in front of dozens of people, treating me like I was some kind of unwanted intruder, all while living in my building and benefiting from my generosity. She wanted to play games with people's lives. She wanted to use her perceived position and status to humiliate those she considered beneath her. She wanted to see what happened when you dismissed someone as unimportant, irrelevant, powerless. Well, it was time for her to learn that some games have consequences she never could have imagined. I sat in my home office at 6 a.m. The morning after the party, looking at the lease agreements and property management files spread across my desk like battle plans. My portfolio included 47 properties across Chicago's most desirable neighborhoods: Lincoln Park, Gold Coast, River North, Old Town. Each one had been carefully chosen, meticulously maintained, and strategically positioned to provide maximum return on investment. Tomoya lived in my Gold Coast penthouse building, Unit 5847, with its panoramic lake views and premium amenities. His rent $4,200 monthly when comparable units in the building rented for $6,800. His medical practice operated out of my Lincoln Park commercial property, Suite 312, in a beautifully renovated medical building with parking and proximity to Children's Memorial Hospital. His lease $8,000 monthly when market rate for similar professional space was $15,000. For 8 years, I'd subsidized their lifestyle to the tune of nearly $40,000 annually. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because I loved them. Because I wanted to give them the foundation they needed to build their careers and their family without the stress of crushing overhead expenses. Neither of them had any idea they were living off the generosity of the tacky old woman they'd had thrown out of their son's birthday party. Neither of them realized that every comfortable aspect of their life existed because of my quiet support and protection. But they were about to learn what happened when you bit the hand that fed you. I picked up the phone and dialed my property manager, Hiroshi Tanaka, a man in his early 50s who had worked with me for over 15 years. He was one of the few people who knew the full extent of my real estate holdings and my relationship to Tomoya. He'd helped me maintain my privacy while building my portfolio, and he understood better than anyone the delicate balance I'd maintained between my public persona and my private success. "Hiroshi," I said when he answered, my voice steady and cold. "It's time to make some changes." Hiroshi had been like a son to me over the years, helping me navigate the complexities of property management while I maintained my carefully constructed public image. He knew about my quiet support for Tomoya's career, and he understood why I'd kept my wealth hidden. He'd been there through every major decision, Every property acquisition, every tenant crisis. Are you sure about this, Marie? Hiroshi asked as we sat in my modest living room later that morning, overlooking the lease documents that would change everything. He knew me well enough to read the determination in my voice, but he also knew how much I loved Tomoya. This is going to shock them. This is going to change their entire life. I looked at the contracts spread across my coffee table like a general reviewing battle plans. Tomoya's penthouse lease current rent $4,200 monthly, market rate $6,800. Medical building lease current rate $8,000 monthly, market rate $15,000. The numbers told a story of generosity that had gone unrecognized and unappreciated for nearly a decade. They made their choice when they had me thrown out of my great-nephew's birthday party, I said, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. I've spent 43 years building this portfolio, Hiroshi. 20 years of that was to provide for Tomoya, to give him opportunities to create a stable foundation for his family. And this is how they repay me. Hiroshi nodded slowly. He'd heard the whole story over the phone that morning, had listened to my voice break as I described the humiliation. The security guard, the way the other guests had stared. He'd seen the hurt in my eyes when I'd walked into his office, looking older than he'd ever seen me look before. What do you want me to do? Market rate adjustments, I said simply. All my properties are implementing new rental rates to reflect current market conditions. It's a standard business decision that any property owner would make in the current economic climate. The beauty of real estate investment is that it can be justified so many different ways. Market pressures, maintenance costs, property improvements, insurance increases, tax assessments. No one questions it when it's presented properly, when it comes from a legitimate business need rather than personal vindictiveness. The penthouse lease will be adjusted to $6,800 monthly. I continued, watching Hiroshi's eyebrows rise. The medical building lease will be set at $15,000 monthly. Both adjustments will take effect with next month's billing cycle. That's a significant increase, Hiroshi observed, doing quick mental calculations. That's an additional $3,600 monthly for housing and $7,000 monthly for the practice. They're going from paying $12,200 total to paying $21,800 total. That's nearly $10,000 more per month. Market rates for premium properties in prime locations, I replied coolly. They've been benefiting from below-market rents for years without even knowing it. It's time they learned what their lifestyle actually costs. Hiroshi was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents with the careful attention he brought to all business matters. Marie, he said finally, using my first name with the gentle familiarity of our long friendship. They're going to know something's wrong. This isn't just a rent increase. This is going to destroy their budget. They'll have to make some serious lifestyle changes. No, I corrected him, my voice harder than I'd intended. Destroying their budget would be evicting them immediately and forcing them to find new housing and office space in a market where comparable properties are even more expensive. This is just bringing their housing costs in line with what everyone else pays for comparable properties. They'll still have their home. They'll still have Tomoya's practice. They'll just have to learn to live within their actual means instead of relying on my hidden subsidies. The truth was, I wanted them to understand what it felt like to struggle with money, to worry about expenses, to face the possibility of losing the lifestyle they'd taken for granted. I wanted them to learn humility the same way I'd learned it 40 years ago when I was working multiple jobs and eating ramen noodles for dinner so I could make my first property investment. I wanted them to know what it felt like to be dismissed, to be considered unimportant, to have their concerns brushed aside by people who thought they were better. When do you want this to take effect? Hiroshi asked. Next month's billing cycle, I said. And Hiroshi, I want it to come as a complete surprise. No advance warning, no preparation time, no gentle transition period. They should find out the same way they made me find out I wasn't welcome at my great-nephew's party suddenly, publicly and without any chance to prepare or object. That weekend stretched endlessly before me like a desert of anticipation and regret. I sat in my small living room, looking at the framed pictures of Tomoya growing up that covered every available surface, remembering every sacrifice I'd made, every choice that had led to this moment. There was the picture of him in his high school graduation gown, beaming with pride as he held his diploma. I remembered working double shifts at the accounting firm that week to help pay for his graduation expenses and the class ring he'd wanted so badly. There was the one of him in his medical school white coat, looking so serious and professional during his first clinical rotation. I thought about the countless hours of overtime I'd put in to help cover his textbooks and equipment, the loans I'd co-signed without him knowing, the way I'd quietly paid for his test prep courses and application fees. I thought about the education fund I'd secretly built for him through rental income from my properties, money he'd never known existed, but that had made the difference between crushing student debt and manageable monthly payments. I thought about the trust fund I'd established for Kenta's future, carefully structured through my legal team so it couldn't be traced back to me, designed to ensure he'd have opportunities regardless of what happened between his parents and me. All the ways I'd tried to take care of my family while staying invisible, while letting them believe their success was entirely their own doing. Sunday night, I barely slept. I kept imagining Tomoya and Sarah opening their mail on Monday, completely unaware that their comfortable world was about to be shaken to its foundation. I pictured Sarah's face when she saw the new lease terms, the shock and outrage when she realized their housing costs had more than doubled overnight. I imagined Tomoya's confusion as he tried to figure out how they could possibly afford to maintain their current lifestyle. Part of me felt sick with anticipation. Part of me wanted to call Hiroshi and cancel the whole thing, to go back to being the invisible benefactor who supported them from the shadows. But then I remembered the security guard's gentle hand on my arm, the stares of the other guests, Sarah's voice dismissing me as someone who didn't know her place. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzling, the kind of Chicago weather that made everything look bleak and uninviting. Perfect weather for what was coming. At exactly 10 a.m., Hiroshi sent out the rent adjustment notices via certified mail and email, ensuring they couldn't claim they never received them. By 10:30, both properties had received their new lease terms, clearly stating the adjusted monthly rates and the effective date. I sat in my small home office, watching raindrops trace paths down the windows like tears, and waited for the explosion. It didn't take long. At 11:20 a.m., my phone rang. The caller ID showed Tomoya's number, and I felt my heart hammer against my ribs like it was trying to escape. This was the first time he'd called me since Kenta's birthday party. The first time he'd reached out since watching his wife have me escorted out like a criminal. I let it go to voicemail, not trusting myself to speak calmly. 15 minutes later, Sarah called. Then Tomoya again. Then Sarah. By noon, they'd left 6 increasingly frantic messages, their voices progressing from confusion to concern to barely controlled panic. Finally, at 12:30, I steeled myself and listened to the voicemails. Tomoya's first message, his voice still confused but not yet alarmed. Aunt Marie, something crazy happened with our rent. I think there's been a mistake with our lease renewal. The numbers don't make any sense. Can you call me back when you get this? Sarah's message, her tone already sharper, more demanding. Marie, we got some kind of notice about our lease that has to be wrong. Our rent can't possibly have tripled overnight. This has to be an error. Please call us back immediately. Tomoya's second message, now with real worry creeping into his voice. Aunt Marie, our rent just jumped to nearly $7,000 a month, and my practice lease doubled. Something's very wrong here. I don't understand what's happening. We need to talk. By 2 p.m., I learned through Hiroshi that both Tomoya and Sarah had spent their lunch break on the phone, with the property management company demanding explanations, requesting meetings with supervisors, insisting there had been some kind of clerical error that needed to be corrected immediately. They want to speak with the property owner directly. Hiroshi reported when he called with an update. Tomoya sounds desperate. Sarah sounds angry. They keep saying they've been model tenants and this has to be some kind of mistake. What did you tell them? That all rental adjustments are based on current market conditions, and that the property owner prefers to work through management rather than involving themselves directly in tenant relations. Standard policy. The beautiful thing about owning property through management companies is that it creates a buffer between the owner and the tenants. It's completely legitimate, completely professional, and completely impossible to argue with. By 3 p.m., both Tomoya and Sarah had submitted formal complaints to the property management company, demanding investigations into what they claimed was obviously discriminatory treatment. They'd also reached out to a tenants' rights organization, convinced that their sudden rent increase must violate some kind of housing regulation. At 4 p.m., Hiroshi called again. They want to know about lease violations, about whether there's any way to contest the increases. Sarah actually asked if someone was trying to force them out of their properties. I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. Sarah was absolutely right. Someone was trying to force them to confront reality. Someone was trying to make them understand what their lifestyle actually cost. Someone was tired of being taken for granted. That evening, I drove past their building one more time. The valet was still taking cars. The doorman still opening doors for residents in expensive suits. I wondered how long Tomoya and Sarah could afford to live there on their current income when their housing costs had more than doubled overnight. I thought about Kenta, probably playing with his toys right now, unaware that his parents' world was beginning to crumble around him. Would they have to move to a smaller apartment, change his preschool, give up the lifestyle that had made them feel so superior to his great-aunt? As I pulled into my own modest parking space next to my aging Toyota, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since my husband died, I felt like I had control over my own destiny. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one being dismissed, ignored, or taken for granted. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as Tomoya and Sarah adjusted to their new reality. But tonight, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. 3 weeks into their new rental rates, the cracks in Tomoya and Sarah's perfect life were starting to show like fissures in expensive porcelain. I knew this because Chicago's medical community was smaller than people thought, especially among pediatric specialists, and word traveled fast when a successful doctor suddenly couldn't afford his practice expenses. Hiroshi kept me informed about their situation with his usual diplomatic precision, delivering updates during our weekly meetings with the careful objectivity of a professional, but the gentle concern of someone who'd watched this family dynamic unfold for years. Tomoya called the office again yesterday. He reported during our monthly meeting, spreading the latest correspondence across my coffee table. He sounds exhausted. His voice is different, strained, worried. He's asking about payment plans, reduced rates, lease modifications, anything to make the numbers work. He even offered to sign a longer-term lease in exchange for a reduction in monthly payments. I tried to ignore the pain in my chest as I imagined my nephew's desperation. My nephew had worked so hard to build his medical practice, spending years building relationships with patients and other doctors, establishing himself as one of the most respected pediatricians in the city. But then I remembered how he'd stood by and watched as his wife had me humiliated at his son's birthday party, how he'd chosen his social status over his family loyalty, and my sympathy faded like morning mist. And Sarah? She's been calling every day, sometimes multiple times, Hiroshi said carefully, consulting his notes. Yesterday, she demanded to speak with the property owner directly. She says there's been some kind of mistake, that they've been model tenants who deserve special consideration. She keeps using words like discrimination and targeting, suggesting that someone has a personal vendetta against them. I knew Sarah was right about being model tenants in the technical sense. They'd never been late with rent, never caused property damage, never filed frivolous complaints about maintenance issues. But being a good tenant doesn't entitle you to below-market rates forever, especially when you treat your benefactor like garbage and have them physically removed from family celebrations. She also mentioned that they're considering legal action, Hiroshi continued. She thinks the sudden rent increase might violate Chicago's rental regulations or constitute some form of harassment. What did you tell her? That all rental adjustments are based on current market conditions and established property management policies. I also reminded her that the lease clearly states that rental rates are subject to adjustment at renewal time, and that both properties are still being rented at or below market rate for comparable spaces in similar locations. This was absolutely true. Even with the increases, they were still getting a decent deal, just not the extraordinary deal they'd been receiving for years without knowing it. By the end of the month, I learned through my network of property managers and real estate professionals that Tomoya and Sarah had spent weeks frantically searching for alternative housing and office space. But in Chicago's competitive real estate market, with their sudden financial constraints and the need to find properties quickly, finding equivalent spaces at prices they could afford was proving nearly impossible. They were trapped between their current lifestyle and their actual financial reality, just like I'd intended. They could accept the new rates and make serious adjustments to their spending, or they could try to find alternatives that simply didn't exist, at prices they could manage with their current income. But what they didn't know was that finding those alternatives was going to be even harder than they thought. I'd spent 40 years building relationships in Chicago's real estate community. I knew property owners and managers throughout the city, and I had a reputation for being fair, professional, and reasonable in my business dealings. A quiet word here, a subtle mention there, and suddenly Marie Yamamoto's opinion carried weight in professional circles. Not blacklisting exactly, that would have been too obvious, too traceable, and frankly too vindictive for my taste. But when landlords called for references, when property managers checked previous rental history, somehow the feedback wasn't quite as enthusiastic as it might have been. They have a tendency to feel entitled to special treatment. I might mention casually to a colleague. They sometimes have difficulty accepting standard business practices. All true statements, all carefully neutral, all delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made them impossible to challenge. The beautiful thing about having real influence is that you rarely have to use it directly. You just have to let people know you're watching, that you have opinions, that your experience with certain tenants might be relevant to their decision-making process. 3.5 weeks after the rent increases took effect, my phone rang on a Saturday morning while I was having coffee and reading the newspaper. The caller ID showed Tomoya's number, and I felt my heart race as I debated whether to answer. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail again, to maintain the distance that had grown between us. But another part of me, the part that had raised him and loved him unconditionally for decades, couldn't ignore his call. "Hello," I said finally, my voice carefully neutral. "Aunt Marie." Tomoya's voice sounded hollow, exhausted in a way I'd never heard before. "Can we talk, please?" I'd been expecting this call ever since the rent increases took effect. But hearing his voice, hearing the desperation and confusion in it, still made my chest tighten with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. "Of course. What's wrong?" "Everything," he said, and I could hear him fighting back tears. "Everything is falling apart and I don't know what to do anymore. Our rent tripled overnight, my practice lease doubled. We can't afford to live in our apartment anymore. We're going to have to move Kenta to a different preschool, find a cheaper place to live, maybe even consider moving out of the city entirely." It took everything I had to keep my voice neutral, to resist the urge to comfort him the way I had when he was a child. "That sounds very difficult." "It's not just difficult, Aunt Marie. It's impossible. We've been good tenants for years. We've paid our rent on time. We've taken care of the properties we lease. But suddenly, everything costs more than we can afford. And nobody will give us straight answers about why this is happening." I closed my eyes, remembering all the times over the past few years when Sarah had found excuses to exclude me from family gatherings. All the subtle ways they'd made it clear I wasn't welcome in their sophisticated world. All the lies they'd told me about Kenta's health to avoid dealing with my overreaction. "Have you talked to your property management company about it?" That's the thing, Aunt Marie. Nobody will give us straight answers. They keep saying it's just market adjustments. But it feels personal, like someone has it out for us specifically. The timing is too suspicious, the increases are too dramatic. It's like someone is trying to push us out of our lives. Tomoya paused, and I could hear him take a shaky breath that reminded me of when he was a teenager dealing with the stress of college applications and the fear of not living up to his potential. The worst part is how it's affecting Kenta. He keeps asking why we're looking at smaller apartments. Why Daddy looks worried all the time, why Mommy cries when she thinks he's not looking. He's only 4 years old, Aunt Marie. He shouldn't have to see his parents like this. He shouldn't have to suffer because of whatever's happening to us. My great-nephew, my beautiful Kenta, who I'd only been allowed to see from a distance since that horrible day at his party. The thought of him confused and scared because his parents' world was crumbling made my heart ache in ways I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't his fault. He was an innocent child caught in the middle of adult conflicts and power struggles. "Tomoya," I said softly, "maybe you should consider that this might be an opportunity to reassess what's really important in life." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe this is a chance to remember what matters most. Family, love, being there for each other instead of chasing status and appearances. Maybe this is a wake-up call to focus on what really counts." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear him thinking, processing what I'd said and what it might mean. Then Tomoya said, "Aunt Marie, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "At Kenta's party, when Sarah had you leave, I should have stopped her. I should have stood up for you. I've been thinking about it a lot lately, especially since all this started happening and I realize I was a coward. I was so worried about making a scene, about embarrassing Sarah in front of her friends, that I let my own aunt be humiliated. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us knew how to cross safely. "Why didn't you defend me, Tomoya?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because I was ashamed," he said, and the raw honesty in his voice broke my heart. "Not of you, Aunt Marie, never of you." I was ashamed of myself, of how I'd let Sarah convince me that we were better than our roots, better than where we came from. She made me believe that success meant distancing ourselves from anything that didn't fit the image we were trying to project. I felt tears building behind my eyes despite my efforts to remain composed. This was the conversation I'd been waiting for, hoping for, but not like this. Not with my nephew broken and desperate. Not with Kenta caught in the middle of our family's dysfunction. "And now?" I asked. Now I realized that Image was built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Everything we thought was solid. Everything we thought made us successful and important. It's all slipping away like sand through our fingers. And the only person who ever really supported me unconditionally, who helped me build my career without me even knowing it, I pushed away because my wife was embarrassed by her. I had to set the phone down for a moment and compose myself. When I picked it back up, Tomoya was still talking, his voice thick with emotion. "Aunt Marie, I've been trying to figure out who owns our building, who owns my practice building. The properties are all managed by the same company, but they won't tell me who the actual owner is. It's like they're protecting someone's privacy, like there's some kind of confidentiality agreement in place." My heart started racing like I was a teenager who'd been caught breaking curfew. I kept thinking, who would have this much influence over our lives? Who would care enough to make sure we had below-market rents for years, then suddenly change everything? And then I remembered all the times you helped me through medical school, the mysterious scholarships that appeared when I needed them most, the way tuition payments somehow always worked out even when I was sure we couldn't afford them, the way money always seemed to appear exactly when I was about to give up. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "Aunt Marie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Do you own our apartment building? Do you own my practice building?" The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. 43 years of carefully constructed separation between my modest lifestyle and my real estate empire, and my nephew had figured it out through desperation and detective work. "Yes," I whispered. "Oh my God." His voice was barely audible. "Aunt Marie." "Oh my God." The buildings where we live and work, the properties that have supported our entire lifestyle for years, you own them all. "Yes." The rent increases that are destroying our budget. The lease adjustments that are forcing us to downsize our entire life. "That was you." "Yes." Another long silence. When Tomoya spoke again, his voice was different, broken in a completely new way. "Why?" I took a deep breath, remembering the humiliation at Kenta's party, the years of subtle exclusion from Sarah, the way my own nephew had stood by and watched as I was treated like I was worthless. "Because you let your wife have me thrown out of my great-nephew's birthday party like I was garbage. Because for years you've allowed her to treat me like I was an embarrassment to your family. Because you needed to learn what it felt like to lose everything. The way I felt when you chose her approval over my love. Aunt Marie." His voice cracked completely. "I had no idea about the properties, about how much you'd helped us, about how much you'd sacrificed to support my career. We thought Sarah thought you were just a retired woman living on a pension. She thought you were beneath her notice. She thought she could humiliate you without consequences. Why didn't you ever tell me about the properties? About the money, about everything you'd built? Because I wanted you to make your own way in the world as a doctor. I wanted you to earn your success through your own merit, your own hard work. Not because of your aunt's wealth. I wanted you to develop character and strength without the cushion of family money making everything easy. But instead I developed arrogance and cruelty. Not you, Tomoya. You were a good man who got lost along the way. But yes, you forgot where you came from. You forgot who supported you and how hard I worked to give you opportunities that others never had." I could hear him crying now, soft sobs that reminded me of when he was little, and had scraped his knee or had a nightmare or was worried about disappointing me. "Aunt Marie, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry for the party, for not defending you, for letting Sarah poison my mind against you, for taking everything you gave me and never even recognizing it, never even being grateful for it. I know you are. What happens now? Are you going to destroy us completely?" Are you going to make sure we never recover from this? I looked around my small living room at the modest life I'd maintained even while building a real estate empire, and realized something important. The anger that had driven me for the past 2 months was finally starting to fade, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of love, disappointment, hope, and the weary recognition that revenge, even justified revenge, was a hollow victory if it destroyed the people you loved most. That depends, I said quietly, on whether you've really learned what I was trying to teach you. What do you mean? I mean, Tomoya, that I need to know you understand what love really means, what family really means, what respect looks like, and why it can't be conditional on someone's social status or bank account. I understand, Aunt Marie. I swear I understand now. And Sarah? A long pause. I don't know if she does yet, but I'm going to make sure she learns. I'm not going to let her treat you badly anymore. I'm not going to choose her approval over your love ever again. For the first time in months, I smiled, really smiled. Not the bitter smile of satisfaction I'd been wearing lately. My nephew was finally coming home. 3 weeks after Tomoya learned the truth about who controlled his fate, I sat in my living room reviewing the lease agreements one more time. The morning sun streamed through my modest curtains, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air, and illuminating the stack of documents that represented years of careful planning and quiet generosity. Hiroshi knocked on my door at exactly 9 a.m., punctual as always, holding a thick folder that contained the next chapter of this complicated family story. "The documentation you requested," he said, setting it on my coffee table with the careful precision he brought to all our business dealings. Both Tomoya and Sarah have submitted formal written apologies to the property management company. Tomoya also included a personal letter requesting a meeting with the property owner. I picked up Tomoya's letter, noting how his usually confident handwriting looked shaky, uncertain. In 4 carefully written pages, he detailed not just his apology for the birthday party incident, but his recognition of a pattern of behavior that had developed over years. He acknowledged allowing his wife to create distance between us, admitted to prioritizing social status over family loyalty, and took full responsibility for failing to defend me when I needed him most. More importantly, he wrote about the conversations he'd been having with Kenta, about teaching his son that love and respect aren't earned through money or position, but through character and kindness, about making sure Kenta understood that his great aunt wasn't someone to be ashamed of, but someone to be proud of, someone who had worked hard and sacrificed much for their family. He wrote about wanting to rebuild our relationship, about recognizing that I had been the stable foundation of his life even when he'd forgotten it, about his desire to make sure Kenta grew up knowing and loving his great aunt instead of being taught to dismiss her as irrelevant. "And Sarah's letter?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew what I'd find. Hiroshi's expression was carefully neutral, the look he wore when delivering news that might be disappointing, less comprehensive. She apologizes for any misunderstanding at the birthday party and acknowledges that her actions may have been inappropriate. She expresses hope that the family can move forward in a spirit of mutual respect. I almost laughed, but not with humor. Even in apology, Sarah couldn't bring herself to admit the full scope of what she'd done. She was sorry for a misunderstanding and actions that may have been inappropriate, not for years of systematic exclusion, not for treating me like I was beneath her notice, not for the calculated humiliation of having me physically removed from my great-nephew's party, not for lying to me about Kenta's health or dismissing my concerns as unimportant. But perhaps that was enough for now. Perhaps true understanding would come later, if it came at all. Perhaps some people needed to learn humility gradually, through experience rather than revelation. "Schedule a meeting with Tomoya for tomorrow," I said. "Just Tomoya." The next day, my nephew walked into my modest living room looking like a different person than the confident, successful doctor who had ignored his aunt's humiliation 2 months ago. He was thinner, more worried-looking, his expensive casual clothes replaced by the simple jeans and sweater of someone who was watching every penny. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and endless worry. But there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen in years: humility, genuine remorse, and a desperate hope for redemption that reminded me of the young man I'd helped raise. "Aunt Marie," he said softly, "and I heard the little boy he used to be, the one who would call me when he was scared or needed advice or just wanted to share good news. Sit down, Tomoya." He settled onto my familiar old couch, looking around the modest apartment with new understanding. I watched him take in the second-hand furniture, the outdated appliances, the simple decorations that reflected a lifetime of careful spending and modest living. Now he knew the truth that this modest lifestyle had been a choice, not a necessity. All these years, he said, shaking his head in wonder and regret, all these years I lived in that penthouse, worked in that beautiful building, built my practice in premium space, and I never knew you were the one making it all possible. That was the point, I said simply. I wanted you to succeed on your own merit. But I didn't, did I? I succeeded because you created opportunities for me, because you provided below-market rent and lease rates that gave me financial breathing room other doctors didn't have, because you loved me enough to stay invisible while supporting my dreams. I nodded, feeling the familiar tightness in my throat that came whenever I thought about the sacrifices I'd made, and the gratitude I'd never expected to receive. Aunt Marie, I need you to know that I've had a lot of time to think these past few weeks about Uncle Kenji's death, about how hard it must have been for you to suddenly become responsible for everything, about how you worked multiple jobs when I was young, how you never complained even when you were exhausted, how you never had expensive things because every dollar went toward investments that would benefit our family. You were my priority, I said simply. You and your future were all that mattered to me. I know that now. But somewhere along the way I forgot. I let Sarah convince me that you were holding us back, that your lifestyle was embarrassing, that we needed to distance ourselves from anything that didn't fit the image we were trying to project. Tomoya leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. She used to make jokes about your apartment, about your car, about the modest gifts you brought to family gatherings. She'd say things like, "Your aunt means well, but she doesn't understand our world. She's from a different generation, a different level." And instead of defending you, instead of telling her she was wrong, I started seeing you through her eyes. Why? Because it was easier, he admitted, his voice breaking slightly with shame. Because I was insecure about my own background, and it felt good to believe I'd risen above it. Because Sarah made me feel sophisticated and successful, and I was afraid that acknowledging where I came from would somehow diminish what I'd achieved. I watched my nephew struggle with the truth of what he'd become, and I felt my anger finally beginning to dissolve into something else. Not forgiveness exactly that would take time, but understanding. The recognition that he'd made mistakes from weakness rather than malice, that he'd been manipulated by someone who knew how to exploit his insecurities. "What do you want now, Tomoya?" "I want my aunt back," he said without hesitation. "I want Kenta to know his great aunt, to learn from her, to understand that strength comes from character, not from money. I want to rebuild what I destroyed through my own stupidity and pride." "And Sarah?" Tomoya was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer. "Sarah is having a hard time with all of this. She's angry about the rent increases, confused about what happened to our life, and she's struggling to accept that the woman she dismissed is actually the person who controls our fate. Is she willing to change? I think she's willing to try. But Aunt Marie, I need you to know that my relationship with you isn't conditional on hers anymore. I've spent too many years letting my wife dictate my relationship with my family. That ends now, regardless of what she decides to do. I studied my nephew's face, seeing the determination there, the genuine remorse. The man I'd helped raise finally emerging from the shell of social pretension he'd built around himself. This was the Tomoya I remembered, honest, caring, willing to do the right thing even when it was difficult. "I'm not going to restore your old rental rates," I said finally. His face fell slightly, but he nodded with resignation. "I understand. We took advantage of your generosity without even knowing it. We don't deserve special treatment. But I am going to offer you a compromise, market-rate rent, but with a family discount that reflects our relationship and my desire to help you succeed. You'll pay fair prices, but not the premium rates I charge to strangers." "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And there will be conditions. Whatever you need." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a set of keys, feeling the weight of them in my palm. "These are to the townhouse on Oak Street. 3 bedrooms, good neighborhood, excellent schools. It's one of my rental properties. But the current tenants are moving out next month. Kenta needs stability, and you need a place where you can rebuild your life at a reasonable cost." Tomoya stared at the keys like they were made of gold. "Aunt Marie, I can't accept special treatment. We've already taken so much from you without even knowing it. You're not accepting special treatment. You're accepting a fair rental rate for family. And in return, I want Sunday dinners every week, Kenta, you and me. We're going to rebuild this family the right way this time, with honesty and respect and love. Tears rolled down my nephew's cheeks as he accepted the keys. What about Sarah? Sarah is welcome when she's ready to be part of a family instead of trying to control it. When she can treat me with the respect she'd show any other person, regardless of their social status or bank account. When she can admit that she was wrong and mean it. She will, Tomoya said quickly. I'll make sure she understands. No, Tomoya. You can't make her understand. She has to choose to understand, just like you had to choose to remember who you really are and what really matters. I stood up and walked over to him, and for the first time in years I hugged my nephew. He held me tight like he used to when he was young and the world felt too big and scary. And I felt some of the hurt I'd been carrying begin to heal. I love you, I whispered. I never stopped loving you, even when you forgot to love me back. I'm so sorry, Aunt Marie. I'm so incredibly sorry for everything. I know you are. And we're going to be okay. 6 months later, I sat in the backyard of the townhouse on Oak Street, watching Kenta play on the swing set Tomoya had built for him with his own hands. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass, and I could hear the sound of children playing in the neighborhood, the distant hum of traffic, the ordinary sounds of a life lived simply and well. My great-nephew ran over and climbed into my lap, his small body warm against mine, chattering about his day at preschool with the unfiltered enthusiasm that only 4-year-olds possessed. He was completely comfortable with the great-aunt he was finally allowed to know, calling me Great-Aunt Marie with pride rather than embarrassment. Tell me the story about the houses again, he said, settling back against my chest. Which story? The one where you started with just one house and worked really hard and now you have lots of houses that help families have nice places to live? I smiled, smoothing his dark hair. Well, a long time ago, after your great-uncle died, I had to learn how to take care of myself. Tomoya appeared in the doorway home from his medical practice, which was now operating successfully in a more affordable building I owned, at fair market rates that reflected our family relationship. He looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years, wearing jeans and a comfortable shirt instead of the expensive suits that had once been so important to his image. His practice was thriving, even in the new location. Patients had followed him, drawn by his genuine care and expertise rather than the prestige of his address. He'd learned that his value as a doctor came from his skills and compassion, not from the impressive building where he worked. Great-Aunt Marie, Kenta said, interrupting my thoughts. Daddy says you're really smart about money. I learned to be smart about money because I had to be, I said. When life gets hard, we learn to be strong. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of iced tea and a plate of cookies she'd baked that afternoon. She still struggled with our new dynamic, still occasionally made comments that revealed her old attitudes, but she was trying. Really trying. She'd learned to say please and thank you when asking for favors, to include me in decisions about Kenta, to treat me like his great-aunt instead of an inconvenience to be managed. The change in her had been gradual, prompted not by shame or fear, but by watching how happy Kenta was when he spent time with me, how much he learned from our conversations, how his behavior improved when he felt connected to his extended family. She'd begun to understand that my relationship with Kenta wasn't a threat to her role as his mother, but an addition to his support system. It wasn't perfect. It might never be perfect, but it was honest. And it was built on respect rather than pretense. Dinner's almost ready, she said, setting the pitcher on the patio table. Should I call when it's time to eat? That would be nice, I said. Thank you, Sarah. She nodded and went back inside. Small progress, but progress nonetheless. She'd even started asking my advice about Kenta's health concerns, genuinely listening to my suggestions instead of dismissing them as the worries of an overprotective old woman. As the sun set behind the trees, Kenta fell asleep in my lap, his breathing deep and even, his small hand still clutching one of my fingers. Tomoya sat down beside us, and we watched the fireflies begin to dance in the gathering twilight. Aunt Marie, he said quietly, do you think Uncle Kenji would be proud of who we became? I thought about my husband, about the man who'd loved his family but died before he could see how far we'd come, about the legacy he'd left behind and the legacy I'd built in his absence. I think he'd be proud that we found our way back to each other, I said. I think he'd be proud that you're teaching Kenta about family and love and treating people with respect, no matter who they are or what they have. And you, are you proud of what you built? I looked at the modest townhouse, at my sleeping great-nephew, at my nephew who'd finally remembered what really mattered. I thought about my real estate portfolio, about the dozens of families it supported, about the opportunities it created for people like the woman I used to be. I'm proud that I never gave up, I said. On the properties, on our family, on you, even when it seemed hopeless. Tomoya reached over and took my hand. Thank you for not giving up on me. As darkness settled around us, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. Not the peace of victory or revenge, but the peace of coming home, of being valued not for what I could provide, but for who I was. The peace of a family that had learned the difference between love and status, between respect and fear. The tacky old woman was gone. In her place sat Marie, matriarch of a family that had finally learned what really mattered. And for the first time in decades, that was enough.